I did everything the way I was supposed to. That's the sentence I repeat in my head when I can't sleep, not as a complaint, but as a fact. I followed the rules that were handed to me. I listened. I adapted. I made choices that looked sensible, responsible, mature. And somehow, that became the problem. Nothing went terribly wrong in my life. No disaster forced me to stop. No scandal exposed a hidden flaw. If anything, my life unfolded exactly as expected. Which is why it took so long to realize I was disappearing inside it. From the outside, my story made sense. It had structure, progression, a clear narrative. Each decision led logically to the next. When people asked how I was doing, I could answer honestly, fine. Not happy. Not miserable. Just, fine. Fine became my default state. At first, I was proud of that. Stability felt like success. I believed discomfort was something you outgrew. That uncertainty belonged to younger, less disciplined versions of yourself. I told myself that wanting more was childish, something to be corrected, not explored. So I corrected myself. Whenever doubt appeared, I rationalized it away. Whenever dissatisfaction surfaced, I labeled it temporary. Whenever a quiet voice inside me suggested a different path, I reminded myself of everything I would lose by deviating. I became very good at convincing myself. Years passed like that. I learned how to function without checking in. How to wake up, perform, respond, plan, repeat, all without asking whether any of it still fit. Life became a sequence of boxes I knew how to tick. And ticking boxes feels productive, even when it's hollow. The first sign something was wrong wasn't pain. It was distance. I began to feel slightly removed from my own days. Conversations sounded familiar before they finished. Achievements landed softly, like objects placed on a shelf I never looked at again. Even disappointment felt muted, as if my emotional range had been carefully compressed to avoid extremes. I thought that was adulthood. I thought that was what people meant when they said life wasn't exciting anymore. What I didn't realize was that excitement wasn't the issue. Presence was. I was there physically, mentally, socially, but not internally. My inner life had gone quiet, not because it was peaceful, but because I had stopped listening to it. I had trained myself out of curiosity. That training was subtle. It didn't feel like repression. It felt like responsibility. Like choosing long-term stability over short-term impulse. Like sacrificing a little joy now for a lot of security later. Except later never arrived. One evening, I caught myself describing my own life as if it belonged to someone else. I was explaining my routine, my plans, my future in a detached, almost observational way, like I was narrating a case study. That scared me. Because it meant I had started relating to myself as an object instead of a participant. I wasn't living my life. I was maintaining it. People praised me for that. They called me grounded, reliable, sensible. They said I had my life together. I nodded along, absorbing their words without resistance, without pride. Because somewhere deep down, I knew something they didn't. I knew that nothing in my life felt chosen anymore. Everything was correct. Everything was appropriate. Everything was justified. And none of it felt like me. That realization didn't explode. It settled. Like a quiet verdict I couldn't appeal. I began to wonder when exactly I had stopped being involved in my own decisions, and whether that moment had passed too long ago to retrieve. I wondered how many times I had silenced myself under the excuse of being reasonable. And then came the thought that changed everything: what if I hadn't failed at life, but succeeded at the wrong one? That question followed me into sleep. Into work. Into moments of forced laughter and polite agreement. It stripped away my excuses without offering solutions. Because if my life was the result of doing everything right, then the problem wasn't circumstance. It was choice. And that meant the responsibility and the loss belonged to me. Once that thought took root, it changed the texture of everything. I started noticing how often I defended my choices without being asked. How quickly I explained myself in conversations that weren't interrogations. How reflexively I justified my life to invisible judges who had never actually questioned it. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't living intentionally, I was living defensively. Every decision I had made could be explained, rationalized, supported by logic. And yet, when I stripped those explanations away, there was very little desire left underneath them. I had confused justification with intention. The ethical trap of a correct life is that it absolves you in advance. As long as your choices are sensible, no one challenges you, not even yourself. You're rewarded for predictability, praised for consistency, shielded from doubt by the approval of others. And approval is addictive. It replaces curiosity with comfort. It makes you loyal to outcomes instead of values. It trains you to ask, will this make sense, instead of does this feel true? I had stopped asking the second question entirely. The internal breakdown didn't come with panic. It came with a steady erosion of meaning. I noticed it in small ways. The way I delayed personal decisions but acted quickly on professional ones. The way I cared deeply about meeting expectations but felt indifferent toward my own future. I realized that if no one was watching, I didn't know what I would choose. That terrified me. Because it meant my identity was built on response, not desire. On adaptation, not direction. I had become fluent in what was required of me and illiterate in what I wanted. I tried to fix that quietly. I told myself I would check in more. Reflect. Journal. Take walks. I treated the problem like a scheduling issue instead of an existential one. I assumed insight would arrive gently if I gave it enough time. It didn't. What arrived instead was grief. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that shows up as nostalgia for a life you never lived. I began mourning alternate versions of myself, not imaginary fantasies, but realistic possibilities I had dismissed as impractical or unnecessary. Paths I could have taken. Conversations I could have started. Risks I could have survived. I hadn't been prevented from these things. I had opted out. And that realization carried a quiet shame. Because shame doesn't come from making mistakes. It comes from recognizing that you knew better and chose comfort anyway. The moral dilemma sharpened into something unavoidable. If I continued living this way, I would remain respected, stable, intact, and increasingly absent from my own life. If I changed, I would disrupt a system that worked. I would have to explain myself in ways that felt messy, emotional, insufficient. Staying was easier to defend. Leaving was harder to justify. But justification had already cost me too much. I reached a point where the correct choice felt unethical, not because it hurt others, but because it erased me. I began to see how doing everything right had become a way of avoiding responsibility for my own existence. Because choosing differently would mean admitting that I had chosen wrongly before. And that admission felt heavier than regret. I noticed my body reacting before my mind caught up. Tightness in my chest when I planned too far ahead. Restlessness during routines I once executed flawlessly. A dull resistance whenever I imagined the future continuing exactly as it was. Something in me was refusing to cooperate. That refusal wasn't rebellion. It was recognition. I understood then that I could no longer pretend ignorance. I had crossed a line where awareness itself demanded response. The cost of staying had become conscious, and conscious costs don't stay abstract. They accumulate. And one night, lying awake, I finally admitted what I had been avoiding: if I stayed on this path, nothing would collapse. That was the tragedy. I would live a full, correct, respectable life. And never once feel like it was mine. The moment I accepted that truth, I stopped looking for permission. Not from others. From myself. I had spent years believing that if a life worked, it deserved loyalty. That stability was something you honored, even when it slowly cost you your voice. That questioning a good life was ungrateful, almost immoral. But something in me had shifted beyond negotiation. I didn't want a dramatic escape. I didn't want to burn anything down. I didn't want to shock the people who trusted the version of me they had always known. What I wanted was simpler and harder. I wanted to be present. That desire scared me more than any reckless fantasy ever had. Presence means responsibility. It means you can no longer hide behind routines or expectations. It means your life stops being an argument you defend and starts being a reality you inhabit. I started with honesty, not public, not performative, just internal. I stopped pretending that I liked things I merely tolerated. I stopped planning a future I felt nothing toward. I stopped calling numbness peace. Those changes didn't show on the outside right away. My life still looked intact. Orderly. Functional. But inside, something essential was returning slowly, awkwardly, without confidence. Choice. Not the kind that comes with certainty. The kind that comes with risk. I made decisions that didn't optimize for approval. I allowed myself to be uncertain in conversations where I had once been polished. I admitted confusion instead of hiding behind competence. I disappointed people gently, honestly, without rushing to repair the discomfort. Some connections weakened. Some expectations dissolved. A few relationships existed only because I had been predictable, and without that predictability, they couldn't survive. That hurt. But it hurt cleanly. For the first time in years, my pain had a source I could name. I didn't become happier overnight. In fact, I felt worse for a while. Grief surfaced not for what I lost by changing, but for what I had lost by staying so long. The years I had traded for correctness. The parts of myself I had edited out so thoroughly they barely recognized me anymore. That grief didn't ask to be solved. It asked to be felt. And feeling it didn't break me. It grounded me. I began to understand something that reframed my entire past: I hadn't failed by choosing safety. I had survived. But survival had quietly turned into a lifestyle, one that no longer served the person I had become. The mistake wasn't doing everything right. The mistake was never asking whether right was still right for me. Now, when I look at my life, it's less impressive on paper. Less symmetrical. Less defensible in arguments. But it feels heavier in a way that matters. It has texture. My days are no longer just correct, they are experienced. I notice resistance when something doesn't fit. I notice curiosity when something calls to me. I notice fear and I don't automatically obey it. That doesn't make me brave. It makes me involved. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels uncomfortably familiar, the quiet success, the intact routines, the sense that your life is technically fine but internally distant, I want to leave you with this: without instruction or pressure, a life can be correct and still be wrong for you. Doing everything right can still cost you yourself. And it's never too late to notice, but it is possible to live so carefully that you forget you were ever meant to choose. I did everything right. And the moment I stopped mistaking correctness for truth, was the moment my life finally began to feel like it belonged to me.